I've always been a creature of habit. My morning routine rarely changes: wake up at 7 a.m., shower, grab a coffee from the same cafe down the street, and take the same route to work. But one Tuesday morning, everything felt off. My alarm didn't go off, I spilled my coffee before leaving the house, and when I finally got on the road, my usual route was blocked due to construction. Frustrated, I had no choice but to take a detour through a part of town I hadn't visited in years. As I drove, I passed by an old diner that sparked a faint memory. I couldn't quite place it, but something about the place felt familiar. Without really thinking, I pulled into the parking lot and decided to grab a second coffee to shake off the morning's bad start. The inside of the diner was like stepping into a time capsule. It had retro booths, a jukebox in the corner, and the kind of atmosphere that felt frozen in the late 80s. I ordered a coffee to go, but as I waited, I found myself drawn to the bulletin board near the entrance. Among the usual flyers for local events and babysitting services was a photo that made my heart skip a beat. It was an old black and white picture of a man standing in front of a gas station, holding a wrench and smiling broadly. The caption read, "In loving memory of Henry Hank Mitchell, 1952 to 1992. Owner of Hank's Auto Shop, beloved friend and father." My father's name was Henry Mitchell. I stared at the photo, my coffee completely forgotten. My dad had died when I was 7, or so I'd been told. But I'd never seen this picture before, nor had I ever heard of Hank's Auto Shop. My father had worked in finance, not as a mechanic, or at least, that's what my mother had always said. I took a picture of the bulletin board and left the diner, my mind racing. Who was this man? Could it be a coincidence? Or was there something about my father's past that I didn't know? When I got to work, I couldn't focus. I spent most of the day Googling Hank's Auto Shop and Henry Mitchell, but I found nothing conclusive. That evening, I called my mom. "Hey, Mom," I said, trying to sound casual, "did Dad ever work as a mechanic before he got into finance?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Why are you asking that?" she finally said, her voice cautious. I told her about the diner and the photo. Her reaction wasn't what I expected. Instead of laughing it off or dismissing it, she sighed deeply. "I didn't think you'd ever find out," she said quietly. Over the next hour, my mom unraveled a story that felt like something out of a movie. Before he met her, my dad had lived an entirely different life in another state. He had been married to a woman named Linda and had a son, my half-brother, Peter. They owned Hank's Auto Shop together until a tragic car accident took Linda's life. Overwhelmed with grief, my dad sold the shop, left Peter in the care of Linda's parents, and moved away to start over. "That's when I met him," my mom explained. "He never wanted to talk about his past, and I respected that. But he always regretted leaving Peter. He thought he was giving him a better life with his grandparents, but it haunted him." I was stunned. I had a half-brother? My dad had an entire other family I'd never known about. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "I wanted to," she said, "but your father made me promise to let the past stay in the past. He didn't want it to overshadow the life we built together. I couldn't let it go." Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with finding Peter. My mom gave me as much information as she could, and after a lot of online digging, I finally tracked him down. He was living just 2 hours away. Reaching out to him was one of the hardest things I've ever done. How do you even begin to explain something like this? I sent him a message through social media, keeping it brief. "Hi, Peter. My name is Alex Mitchell. I believe we might be half-brothers. Our dad was Henry Mitchell. I'd love to talk if you're open to it." He responded a few days later, skeptical but willing to meet. The first time we met, it was surreal. Peter looked so much like our dad, same broad shoulders, same crooked smile. We spent hours talking, comparing stories about our lives and piecing together the puzzle of our shared history. Peter had known about me, but only vaguely. His grandparents had mentioned that his dad had remarried and had another child, but they never gave him details. Meeting me brought him a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. For me, meeting Peter felt like discovering a missing piece of myself. It was strange, but in a way, it also felt natural. Despite the years and the distance, there was an undeniable connection between us. That detour on a random Tuesday morning led to something I never could have anticipated. It uncovered a family secret, introduced me to a brother I didn't know I had, and gave me a deeper understanding of my father's life. Sometimes, life takes you down unexpected paths. What starts as an inconvenience or a detour can lead to something extraordinary. For me, it was a chance to uncover the truth about my family and to connect with someone who, despite the years apart, felt like a part of me all along. Second story. I've always been a sucker for thrift stores. There's something magical about wandering through aisles packed with forgotten treasures. It's like diving into a sea of stories waiting to be discovered. Over the years, I've built quite the collection of quirky finds: old vinyl records, vintage postcards, even a typewriter that still works. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I stumbled upon one rainy Saturday afternoon. The store was quiet, save for the soft hum of indie music playing through overhead speakers. I was combing through a shelf of knickknacks when I spotted it, a battered wooden jewelry box with delicate carvings on the lid. It wasn't particularly remarkable at first glance, but something about it drew me in. Maybe it was the craftsmanship or the fact that it looked handmade, but I decided to buy it for $10. When I got home, I set the box on my coffee table and examined it more closely. The carvings were intricate, tiny flowers and vines intertwined with initials. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the box, half expecting it to be empty. Instead, I found a small stack of yellowed letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The letters smelled faintly of lavender, and the paper was so fragile I had to handle them carefully. Each one was addressed to Eleanor Mason, and the return address was from someone named James H., postmarked from the late 1940s. I wasn't trying to be nosy, but who wouldn't be intrigued? I read the first letter, then the next, and before I knew it, I had devoured the entire stack. They were love letters, each one more passionate than the last. James wrote about how much he missed Eleanor, how he dreamed of their future together, and how he couldn't wait to return from his service overseas. But the last letter stopped me cold. It was dated May 1949, nearly 2 years after the others. It wasn't from James, it was from a woman named Lillian, who wrote to Eleanor with the heartbreaking news that James had died in a car accident shortly after returning home. She also mentioned a son James had fathered before the war, or a boy Eleanor knew nothing about. I sat there, stunned. Who was Eleanor? Did she ever receive these letters? And what happened to James' son? The next day, I returned to the thrift store and asked the owner about the jewelry box. She said it had been part of a house clean-out, but didn't have any further details. Determined to learn more, I started digging. The return address on the letters was from a small town about 3 hours away. I decided to take a road trip, armed with the letters and a determination to piece together the story. When I arrived, I visited the local library and searched through old records. It didn't take long to find an obituary for James Hamilton, dated May 1949. It confirmed the details from Lillian's letter. James had indeed died in a car accident, leaving behind a young son, Charles. With some help from the librarian, I found an address for Charles, who was now in his 70s. I wrestled with whether or not to reach out, but in the end, I decided he deserved to know about the letters. Meeting Charles was surreal. He invited me into his modest home, and I explained everything: how I found the letters, what they contained, and why I thought they might be connected to him. He listened intently, his eyes misty as I handed him the stack of letters. "These are my father's handwriting," he said softly, running his fingers over the paper. As we talked, Charles revealed that he'd grown up knowing very little about his father. His mother, Lillian, had remarried, and James' memory had faded into the background of his life. Seeing the letters brought a piece of his father back to him in a way he never thought possible. But the story didn't end there. Charles mentioned that Eleanor Mason had been a name he'd heard in passing from his mother. Curious, I delved deeper, and with Charles' blessing, I tracked down Eleanor's family. Eleanor had passed away years ago, but her granddaughter, Clara, was alive and well. She was fascinated when I shared the story and invited both Charles and me to visit her. The meeting between Charles and Clara was nothing short of magical. They spent hours poring over family photos, connecting dots between their families and filling in gaps in their shared history. It turned out that Eleanor had always wondered what happened to James, but she never received Lillian's letter. The jewelry box and its contents had somehow been lost or forgotten over the decades. For me, being part of their reunion was an incredible experience. I watched as two strangers, bound by the threads of a long-lost story, became family in a way neither had expected. Looking back, it's still hard to believe that a simple trip to a thrift store led to such a profound discovery. That $10 jewelry box didn't just hold letters, it held a legacy, a connection, and the power to bring people together. Sometimes, life's greatest stories aren't the ones we live ourselves, but the ones we uncover and pass along. This experience reminded me of the importance of preserving the past, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem. You never know what treasures and truths are waiting to be rediscovered. Third story. I've always prided myself on being the kind of person who helps others. You know, the type who holds doors open, lends jumper cables without hesitation, or carries groceries for an elderly neighbor. But one evening, that inclination to help led me into an experience I'll never forget, one that pushed my boundaries, tested my patience, and ultimately changed how I see the world. It was a Friday evening, late summer, and I was driving home after visiting my parents in the next town over. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky streaked with deep purples and oranges. I was cruising down a winding country road with my windows down, enjoying the warm breeze and the faint hum of cicadas. I had just turned a sharp bend when I spotted a car parked on the shoulder. Its hazard lights blinked like tiny beacons in the growing darkness. A woman stood a few feet away, leaning against the car with her arms crossed. She looked frustrated, maybe even a little anxious. I slowed down, hesitated for a moment, then pulled over a few feet ahead of her vehicle. Grabbing my phone and flashlight, I stepped out and approached cautiously. "Hi there," I called out, keeping my tone light and friendly. "Car trouble?" She turned toward me, visibly startled, but her expression quickly softened. "Yeah, it just died on me," she said, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. "I think it might be the battery, but I'm not sure." Her name was Tessa. She looked to be in her late 20s, wearing jeans and a faded hoodie. After a brief conversation, it was clear she wasn't just stranded, her phone battery had died, and she had no way to call for help. "Lucky for you," I said, trying to lighten the mood, "I've got jumper cables in my trunk." She smiled, and for a moment, her frustration seemed to fade. We spent the next 15 minutes trying to jumpstart her car, but it refused to cooperate. By then, the sky had grown dark, and the road was eerily quiet. "Do you live nearby?" I asked, glancing around. "No," she admitted. "I was heading back to the city after visiting a friend. It's about an hour from here." Her vulnerability tugged at me. Leaving her there alone didn't sit right. "Look," I said, "I can give you a ride to the nearest gas station or wherever you feel comfortable. We'll figure something out from there." Tessa hesitated but eventually nodded. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We rode in silence at first, the hum of the engine the only sound between us. After a while, Tessa opened up. She told me she'd recently moved to the city for a new job but hadn't made many friends yet. Her trip to visit an old college friend was supposed to be a break from the loneliness she'd been feeling. Her honesty struck a chord with me. I'd moved to the area a few years back and remembered how isolating it could be at first. As she spoke, I realized we had more in common than I'd expected. About 20 minutes into our drive, my phone buzzed with a notification. I glanced at the screen, but it wasn't a number I recognized. Ignoring it, I focused on the road. We eventually reached a small gas station, one of those places that seemed frozen in time with its dim fluorescent lights and ancient soda machine. I offered to wait with her while she called a tow truck. But as she dialed, her face paled. "My wallet," she whispered, patting her pockets and then her bag. "I think I left it in the car." I could see the panic in her eyes. She was stranded, without money or identification, and reliant on the kindness of a stranger, me. "It's okay," I said quickly. "We'll figure this out." Over the next hour, I paid for the tow truck and even covered the fee for her car to be taken to a nearby mechanic. She protested at first, but I insisted. "Consider it a pay-it-forward thing," I told her. "Help someone else out when you can." Tessa smiled, and for the first time that evening, it seemed genuine. The next day, I got a call from an unknown number. It was Tessa, thanking me profusely and promising to repay me as soon as she could. We chatted for a while, and before I knew it, we'd set up a time to meet so she could return the money. That meeting turned into coffee, which turned into a long conversation about life, work, and everything in between. We began texting occasionally, then hanging out every now and then. Over time, Tessa became one of my closest friends. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. About a year after that fateful night, Tessa called me, her voice shaky. She'd uncovered something shocking about the mechanic where her car had been towed. It turned out the shop had been running a scam, overcharging customers and even sabotaging vehicles to rack up repair fees. Tessa's experience, coupled with accounts from other victims, led to an investigation that shut the place down. She even testified in court, helping to bring justice to countless people who'd been taken advantage of. Through it all, our bond only grew stronger. Tessa often joked that her car breaking down was the worst thing that ever happened to her. Looking back, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd driven past that night. Would Tessa have been okay? Would the mechanic scam have gone unnoticed? It's a reminder that even the smallest decisions, like pulling over to help someone, can ripple out in ways you'd never expect. And sometimes, the connections we make in those moments end up changing our lives in the most beautiful, unexpected ways.